record. And so with that, I'm going to start it to record. And Lisa Van Fleet, the floor is yours.
Thank you. All right, so everybody can hear me. And I would ask Rita if those admit blocks pop up, will you click people in, because I'll be distracted. So I think before I pull up my presentation, I want to say that I think what we just witnessed in terms of working out the mechanics of this presentation, working through the technology issues, is really a perfect demonstration of the challenges we face with our cybersecurity obligations as ERISA fiduciaries and HR administrators. Is that we have an incredible depth of expertise in ERISA. Most of us don't have any expertise in IT. And that's one of the challenges of complying with the DOL EBS, guidance that suggests that mandates that we implement cybersecurity policies, is that we really don't have the expertise. We are used to taking ERISA guidance and just diving into it and creating governance plans, creating policies, creating administrative manuals that fully comply with ERISA. When it comes to our obligation to engage in cybersecurity compliance and protections, reality is we don't have all the expertise. We've got the expertise from the ERISA standpoint, but we will, as you see under the DOL guidance, have an obligation to bring in senior IT officials who can sort of complement the IT requirements. And so this is a team effort, unlike anything we generally see in ERISA compliance. I'm going to share my screen now. And this is the presentation that we are going to discuss. So let me see my page. Oh my gosh, my page down. There we go. Further demonstrating that. Got it. So why do we care about cybersecurity? We all hear the stories, the horror stories, but the reality is when you look at the facts, they're kind of worse than the horror stories. It takes 3 seconds for a hacker to encrypt a piece of data, and they can attack a server every 11 seconds. Last year, the average payment to hackers was $1.5 million. And the average compliance cost with respect to a cybersecurity incident was $4.5 million. That's bad enough, but qualified retirement plans are kind of like the fat hog sitting out there drawing the attention of hackers, because what other area in society, in the finance world, do we have a pool of over $9 trillion in assets and highly valued personal identifiable information with respect to 140 million participants? We are just like, candy in the candy store for hackers. And so it's incumbent upon us to protect and understand that not that we may be a target, we need to expect that we will be a target. And as fiduciaries and administrators for our plans, that means we have an obligation to protect. So the bottom line is, as a result of that, it is incumbent upon, it is the duty of fiduciaries to implement ERISA cybersecurity compliance plans. The purpose of these plans is obvious: protect plans, protect fiduciaries from cybersecurity breaches and non-compliance. We also need to protect participants from unauthorized access to and acquisition of information that could result in identity theft or fraud. The challenge is, like I already mentioned, is that the guidance is highly technical and complex, and we frankly can't implement these protections and policies without utilizing the expertise of others within our organization, most notably senior IT folks with high degrees of expertise. It can also become necessary to invoke the input of legal, our contracts departments, and our corporate governance department. So the legal background for ERISA and cybersecurity is really quite recent. Initially, we had some ERISA litigation that asserted various theories by which to hold fiduciaries responsible for breaches and identity fraud. Talk about those very briefly. Then those were followed up, that case law development was followed up with ERISA regulatory agencies acknowledging the need for guidance and then issuing guidance. That was followed up as soon as that guidance was issued with the DOL audit initiative. In other words, action from the DOL to say, hey, we're serious about your compliance with this guidance. And then we saw some other government agencies issue guidance. And one that I think is particularly instructive is the SEC guidance for a number of reasons that we'll talk. And then, of course, we have state law. Generally we enjoy ERISA preemption of state law, but this is not an area that's traditionally subject to ERISA preemption. So we could have state law obligations as well. For obvious reasons, I will not be going into the various state laws that could govern this. I will say that I've not seen at this point any state law claims asserted in the courts with respect to ERISA cybersecurity compliance. So let's take a brief look at the starting point, which was case law. And we saw case law evolve in two separate paths. The first path was to treat participant data as a plan asset, entitled to the same protections as the actual monetary assets and value in ERISA trusts. The theory was that participant data could only be used for the exclusive purpose of providing plan benefits, and the prohibition of arrangements where vendors used that data for other purposes for which they are engaged. For instance, the classic example is you've got somebody providing investment vehicles or advice, and then they use the participant data to sell outside the scope of the vendor arrangement IRAs. That's a classic example. And what we saw from courts was a split of authority. Some courts were willing to accept this theory, others were not. Frankly, I don't think the ERISA statutory scheme supports this theory. When we look at what is a plan asset, there is no instance in the regulatory guidance where participant data is treated as plan asset. But the other line of case law was to treat the obligation to protect participant data and assets, to equate that to a fiduciary standard of loyalty and care. Sorry, starting over there. There we go. To say that we should expect fiduciary breaches in this environment. And so since it's a known threat to participants and their benefits, then that means that there is an ERISA fiduciary obligation to protect against it. The advantage of this theory is that if this is a fiduciary standard of care, That means that you can defend yourself against liability by implementing good cybersecurity governance measures, including participant education about how to keep themselves safe. So in the wake of this evolving case law, the DOL saw a real need to create guidance for fiduciaries in terms of what they need to do to protect participants and plan assets. And we had some very initial, very loose, frankly, non-helpful guidance in 2011, 2016 that was like their baby steps in acknowledging that there are obligations to protect participants with respect to cybersecurity issues. And then we saw that blossom in 2021 when the DOL EBSA issued 3 pieces of guidance, one of which was addressing cybersecurity program best practices, the other of which addressed tips for hiring service providers to protect against cybersecurity breaches, and the third, which required that you provide online security tips for plan participants. In other words, participant education about risks and steps that they can take to protect themselves. That was a big piece of guidance that we saw in 2021. We saw a little bit of follow-up in 2022. One was a piece on addressing cybersecurity issues for health plans. And that raises a good point because we're going to talk about this in the context of retirement plans. But the reality is any ERISA plan is subject to these same standards of care with respect to cybersecurity risks. It's just that retirement plans, like I said, is the big fat pig on the table that is attractive to hackers and folks with bad intent because of the amount of personally identifiable information and this huge pool of assets. Welfare plans typically don't have a big trust of assets to access. They're also subject in many cases to HIPAA privacy requirements. And so retirement plans are the desired target. And then finally, we saw a piece issued in 2023 that focused purely on educating participants about how to protect themselves from breaches. Following the issuances of this guidance, we immediately saw DOL action on audits. They immediately issued cybersecurity audits, and their audits are based on guidance. That guidance that we just talked about is not regulatory guidance, so it has sort of limited, binding authority. Nonetheless, the DOL immediately commenced these audits. And you can see what we have here is a typical document request. And so you can see what they're focused on. Basically, they were requesting all cybersecurity and information security program policies, procedures, and guidelines by the plan sponsor or vendor. And they're looking for documents that evidence action taken by fiduciaries and vendors to protect the plan and the assets. Their document request also includes document requests about cybersecurity insurance, which is sort of interesting because that is not a component of the guidance that they issued since 2021. But we see that they are very focused on insurance, and that becomes part of our obligations in implementing a strong cybersecurity insurance policy or policy. And then with respect to penalties, as is the case with most DOL audit initiatives, they generally start off without imposing draconian penalties. What they usually do is use the audit to signal that we care about this, we think it's important, and you better get yourself in line because our next step will be penalties. Now, the guidance itself does not provide for implementation of penalties. However, to the extent that a breach can be deemed attributable to a fiduciary breach of obligation, then the DOL would be authorized to impose penalties. Then, as I said, we've seen guidance issued from other governmental agencies. I think the SEC cybersecurity guidance is particularly instructive with respect to ERISA compliance. There's an interaction with cybersecurity compliance in terms of, to the extent a plan sponsor is required to implement this cybersecurity compliance program to comply with the SEC and to report that on an annual basis and to report breaches within 4 business days, that sort of suggests what the government would expect from with respect to any cybersecurity, policy. The other thing is that you can coordinate these programs so that you don't have 2 completely independent cybersecurity policies. To the extent you can get a little more mileage for your effort by combining the 2 policies, which have tremendous amount of overlap, that can be quite helpful and efficient in terms of compliance. So let's look at what some of these SEC's cybersecurity rules require and how that, lends itself to ERISA compliance. Basically, the SEC compliance expectations include the key components that are also included in ERISA cybersecurity compliance programs. One of which is that your program and the people involved in developing, implementing, and maintaining that program needs to include senior stakeholders in cybersecurity risk management. We see that in the ERISA guidance as well. It also requires training and testing of the cybersecurity framework. It must include a program, a procedure for responding to breaches. And one key thing is it says, you can't approach this in any other way than assuming that threats will occur, that cybersecurity breaches and threats, are a part of our life, which means as a fiduciary, you have to prepare for them. The other commonality between the SEC guidance and the ERISA guidance is that obligations extend to third-party vendors. So when you and we'll discuss this later, but basically in hiring and retaining vendors, you have an obligation to ensure that they are also engaging in state-of-the-art cybersecurity compliance protections. Under both pieces of guidance, it is required that employers, fiduciaries engage in regular risk assessments, response plans, and recovery plans. And then finally, it requires that company engage in regular testing, ideally with some kind of third-party sign-off. So cyber compliance testing and continual updates, because threats evolve, the technology evolves. So the SEC guidance, even though it's not directly on point, I think supports and affirms the approach that's required with respect to ERISA plans. State law, as I said, is something that we need to take into account because it's not necessarily preempted. And that's the kind of thing that your IT folks, that's the kind of expertise that they bring to the table in terms of what are state law obligations. And frankly, they can vary widely from state to state. So with that kind of background and overview, let's look to the key steps in an ERISA cybersecurity compliance program. The first thing that is required under these compliance guidelines is an actual written cybersecurity policy, and we will talk about that in a little more detail. It also requires participant education. Participants are deemed to be the weak link when it comes to violations, when it comes to identity theft. So it's absolutely key that you engage in participant education and then that be part of your policy and part of your action plan. Vendor reviews, as mentioned, is also a key component of a compliance program. And then finally, insurance coverage. So breaking down, looking at the first requirement, this is a very cumbersome requirement to design and implement and administer a cybersecurity policy. Basically, it requires that you have a formal written ERISA governance document to address each of the three aspects of DOL guidance: best practices, participant education, and guidelines for hiring and retaining vendors. The objective, which should be stated in the policy, is to describe the objectives and guidelines for protecting participant data and assets. It's also one of the objectives is to encourage communications between fiduciaries and parties involved with data use and protections. And that means parties within the company and parties outside of the company, such as vendors. It requires that one of the stated objectives should be establishing formal criteria to select and monitor the vendor's cybersecurity policies. And then in order to comply with ERISA, it requires a component of participant education. All of these need to be identified as objectives in the policy, followed up by steps that are necessary to actually achieve these objectives, and then implementation of those steps. And then finally, coordinating as appropriate with company information security policies. One, as a matter of a consolidated approach to cybersecurity. Two, because like I said, you can sort of double the mileage that you get out of a policy to the extent you coordinate with another company policy and hopefully a global overriding policy. So let's talk about the policy basics. It is key under both DOL guidance and SEC guidance that you define the roles and responsibilities of individuals who sit on this committee for, administer the cybersecurity policy. And you must include, in order to be compliant, senior IT officials with the expertise to identify, implement, administer, and test for cybersecurity compliance. Frankly, including the Chief Information Security Officer or their equivalent is a best practice with respect to this issue. And the thing is, here's where you see IT folks don't understand ERISA. They don't understand ERISA governance. They don't understand the depth of fiduciary responsibilities and exposure. And so it really takes a combination of ERISA expertise and IT expertise to design, implement, and administer a compliant policy. And that's a little different than we're used to. Usually when we have an ERISA governance obligation, we can hole up, the administration committee, the fiduciaries can go into a room, look at the ERISA requirements, draft a compliance governance policy, like, committee guidelines and that sort of thing. But in this case, it is essential, it is critical to include folks with other expertise. The policy must also implement policies and procedures to identify risks. It must engage in regular risk assessments, no less frequently than annually. And again, this is something we can't come up with. We simply don't have the expertise, but IT does. It requires that you develop security to protect the assets, data, and systems, and that you have a policy for monitoring, detecting, and responding to cybersecurity events. There must be a policy with steps for recovering from when there is an event and disclosing the event to the extent appropriate. As we saw, the SEC requires public disclosure within 4 business days of a material cybersecurity event. That is not our standard for ERISA, but what we see is that the government views that as being an appropriate standard. So what will our standard be for disclosing the event? Who receives the disclosures? How frequently? In what form? But it is a component of the policy that must be included. And then there must be procedures for restoring normal operations and services. Some additional items to think about in connection with the cybersecurity policy is that you must document the framework that is used to assess the security of the systems. Again, this is really an IT contribution. You must document practices and strong access control procedures. And these kind of checklist items are items that your IT folks would identify and expand upon. And then finally, you must conduct cybersecurity awareness training annually, including an explanation to users. So there's kind of 2 prongs to this training. One is to train the people like us, who are actually using the system to understand, what our requirements are, what our reporting obligations are when we seek assistance from IT. And the other aspect of this is participant training. I think we're toward the end of what's required in the policy. Once this policy is developed, it should be reviewed and approved by senior leadership. It should also be reviewed and updated as necessary, and absolutely no less frequently than annually. And that's because of the rapidly evolving risks and types of risks that are created in the cybersecurity world. Ideally, we strongly recommend that the policy be reviewed by a third-party auditor who can confirm compliance. Third-party auditors can review the policy, they can review it in operation, they can conduct testing and risk assessments, and they can give you a certification. And while that's an expense that is kind of a new expense associated with plans, it's as close to bulletproof as you can get with respect to your compliance policies. Other things that the policy should include, it's kind of a monster. It's not a single document. A compliance policy should also include a number of other documents, such as a written information security program, a cyber and information security policy. It should include an incident response plan, which we mentioned before. What's required in terms of disclosure and what kind of disclosure. It should include a business continuity plan. So once one of these breaches occurs, what's our business continuity? Do we have backup? Do we have offsite backup? How do we move forward? And then finally, vendor contract management plan. And we'll talk about vendor management a little bit later. In addition, the policy should include as many as the DOL best practices as you can actually deliver. Obviously, if you include a best practice in your policy that you can't comply with, you've set yourself up for liability. But the more of these best practices that you can include and actually comply with, the more bulletproof you are with respect to cybersecurity related liability. So just to give you an idea of what's included in the DOL's best practices, this is kind of a partial list, and we're not going to, walk through these, but what this does is provide a checklist and sort of an eye opener as to once you start creating that policy, what's involved. With that, we'll move on to participant education. And participant education is absolutely critical. There have actually been cases where fraud and, fraud that led to depletion of participant accounts, fraud that led to identity theft occurred. And because the employer, the plan sponsor, had participant education features in effect, they were absolved of liability with respect to those breaches. And, a classic example in one case is participant's account balance was emptied by an ex-boyfriend, girlfriend, with whom they had shared their password. The employer pointed to their SBD, so we're not talking sophisticated, we're just talking an SBD that said, hey, passwords are sensitive, don't share them with people, or don't share them with people that you're not prepared to, allow to take action with respect to your account. And that alone, that provision in the SBD, rescued that employer, that plan sponsor from any liability for that theft that occurred with respect to the participants' accounts. And the education is not particularly, it's just a collection of common sense. And again, IT folks can add to, suggestions with respect to participant education. They can explain why we have these, what it protects against. And that can be helpful. Like for someone to simply say, hey, register and set up your online account and then monitor it. They're kind of like, well, why do I need to do that? And the reality is a lot of participants don't monitor their retirement accounts. They sort of put the money in there and forget it. But if they don't routinely check their accounts, then fraud, theft can happen, and they won't know about it until it's way too late to do anything about it. And that alone is a factor that weighs against them in terms of seeking recovery from the plan sponsor. If they discover, that fraud occurred and their account balance was empty 3 years ago, that's a little late to come to the game and say, well, you have liability with respect to this. Then we see the kind of classic, guidance that we see every time we deal with our accounts. So the question is, how do you educate participants with this? Well, SBDs, when they make their deferrals, statements, formal programs, emails that educate them, but you need formal guidance that you can document that they've received and maybe even document that they've reviewed and participated in. Then we get to vendor review. This is creates a bit of a burden for folks involved in plan administration, because we all use vendors to help administer plans and then perform all kinds of functions. But this is an absolutely critical aspect of the cybersecurity compliance program and compliance. And it requires that when you are RFPing when you're actually selecting a vendor, that you include cybersecurity compliance as a key aspect of your criteria and review. So you need to review their standards. You need to compare them to industry standards. How do they determine that their practice is state of the art and that it's compliant? And do they have it checked? Do they use an outside auditor to determine that they've got state of the art, security compliance programs and that they're being evaluated? You might want to ask about the ability to review their results and complying with the standard. You also want to look at their track record with respect to breaches in issues and ask that they describe those to you. On that point, the easiest way or kind of the most simple way to sort of sum up that they're appropriately compliant is to look for vendors that follow a recognized standard for information security and use, and that use an outside third party, like an auditor, to review and validate their cybersecurity compliance. Now, if you're a public company, you may already have this being done and performing SOX testing and that demonstrate compliance, in which case, again, you can piggyback off that. You can use it for your ERISA compliance as well. Some additional things that you can do when you're evaluating a vendor, and this is not just when you're hiring a new vendor, this is ongoing monitoring, because we all know that sometimes we hire vendors and they're there for a couple of years. So it's important to monitor how they're continuing to comply and evolve their compliance. So part of this can be asking about past security breaches and the details of, what breach occurred, why it occurred, how the vendor responded, how they remedied it. The other thing you want to do is confirm that they have insurance policies to cover losses. Losses attributable to failures, attributable to theft, whether it's internal, whether it's external. And most importantly, does that insurance cover you as, the person utilizing their services, or does it only cover the vendor? You want to ensure that your service agreement requires ongoing compliance with cybersecurity and information security standards, and sort of along the lines of that insurance, beware of provisions that limit their exposure for breaches. I know we see this on the next slide, but one of the other things we want to know is, how do they handle a breach in terms of notice? How quickly will you be notified? What is the form of the notification that occurs? And, their commitment to cooperate with investigations and reasonably address the cause of the breach. And we see that, in here. So some of the contract terms, and this is why I say when we're talking about these vendors, we've talked about in the cybersecurity policy how critical it is that you have senior IT folks with expertise. When we talk about these vendor reviews, IT reviews kind of go beyond the scope of what we're used to doing as HR professionals and ERISA fiduciaries. You may need to bring in legal, or you may need to bring in IT to really understand and maximize protection with respect to these provisions. So once again, compliance will require utilizing the appropriate expertise within your company, or maybe you need to go outside the company. So other contract terms that you want to look for is their information security reporting. What are their provisions on the use of sharing of information and confidential information? Again, the notices that I just mentioned, and their compliance with applicable laws regarding record retention, destruction, privacy, information security laws, including state laws. And then finally, insurance, which brings us to the fourth leg of our ERISA cybersecurity compliance program, And that is ensuring that you have adequate insurance. And frankly, this is harder than, much more difficult than it seems. Once more, will likely require the involvement of experts, either from legal, or if you have an insurance group or IT group, because it's very difficult to break these down. A cybersecurity policy in and of itself, which I often have clients who say, I've got a cybersecurity compliance program or policy, I'm good. Well, you really have to dig into it, because these policies complement and interact with, but don't provide the same comprehensive coverage. You know, the different policies, different policy types have different coverages, as your fidelity coverage, your crime insurance coverage, your fiduciary liability insurance coverage. So you really have to look not just at the cybersecurity insurance coverage, but you also have to look at how it interacts with these other policies to make sure there's no gaps in coverage. And the easiest example for purposes of understanding this is that cybersecurity insurance policies don't cover theft of plan assets, but a fidelity policy might cover that. A crime policy might cover that. A fiduciary liability policy might cover that. So it really requires a comprehensive review, integrated review of these various policies that you have and how they interact. It's quite a challenge, but critical to protection of the plan, protection of the participants, protection of the company. The other huge challenge with respect to cybersecurity insurance coverage is that the costs have just ballooned. And, you know, that is simply a reflection of the increased incidence of cybersecurity breaches and fraud. So, some other things that you need to understand about the cybersecurity insurance policies is that they're not typically plan specific. You don't go buy a cybersecurity policy for your plan. You buy a cybersecurity policy for your entire company that includes plans, you know, like to the limited extent that they do. As I said, these policies don't address theft, so you need to get that coverage somewhere else. They also typically exclude coverage for breaches resulting from fiduciary duty. So like if there's a fiduciary duty breach, it results in a liability violation of your cybersecurity policy, then these policies don't typically kick in. Now, that doesn't mean they're not open for negotiation. You can try to negotiate better coverage, but they're typically not part of a standard policy and will require the involvement of folks with expertise on cybersecurity policies. Some other things to think about is because these policies are issued on a sort of the company-wide basis, they have certain requirements. The policy carriers have certain requirements that you must comply with before they'll issue the policy. And these are some examples of the kinds of requirements that must be in place at the company-wide level, let alone the plan, you know, so both. These type of protections have to be in place before they'll issue a policy. Now, if you've got a good cybersecurity policy in place, these points would be addressed under the ERISA policy. But now you have to look at, well, can we check those boxes from a company-wide perspective? So the bottom line is, you know, this is a huge and evolving and expanding area of exposure for ERISA covered plans, especially retirement plans. And the DOL and EBSA have recognized that, and they are on an aggressive path to incent, you know, whether it's with you know, the stick or the carrot. DOL tends to use the stick, to ensure that ERISA fiduciaries take the action necessary to, in their minds, fulfill their fiduciary obligations. And I agree, I don't know how you could say it's not part of your fiduciary duties to protect against these known risks. And it's not a possible risk. There's a chance of a risk. This is deemed to be you should expect this. It's a question of when, not if. As part of protecting yourselves, it's absolutely critical to understand what insurance does and doesn't cover with respect to your ERISA plans, and to review what you have in place and supplement as necessary. And then to be aware, like I said, that the DOL is conducting compliance audits, which is their standard precursor to enforcement. Typically, they come out, they do these audits. It's their kind of way of saying, hey, we're educating you, we're letting you know our expectations. And then after a period of time, they start slapping the penalties. So that's what we need to know. I included just a couple of additional pieces just as resources. This is the formal DOL list of best practices. So you see it's even longer. This is a good checklist it's a checklist for your IT folks, and for you to work with them, because they understand all of what's required behind each of these best practices. And then also, that you should outline in your policy how you're going to respond to a cybersecurity incident or breach. Just like we require from vendors, we require that vendors have a program in place for responding. You must have one, and it should be in your policy. So,
Lisa, that was just wonderful, just a wonderful. Please, I know you were concluding there, but I'm just listening to you, and it's so inspiring to hear.
Thank you. I was wrapping up because I understand that you like to give people an opportunity to ask questions.
Some questions,
so,
yes, please.
no.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead. I believe I can unmute your lines here. So let's see here. All right, if you'd like to ask any questions of Lisa, one of the questions that just came in is, will the slide deck be shared? Yes, this is being recorded, so you'll have not only the recording on YouTube, but you'll also, Lisa, I guess I'll have you answer that question.
Yeah, the slide deck can be shared. I assumed it would be somehow included with the video, but that's technology that you have to ask. I'm still muted. Now I'm unmuted.
There we go. There we go.
I was going to say, yeah, I have no problem with sharing the slide deck. I assumed it would be, and I hope it's helpful. I think, we've been consumed with Secure and Secure 2.0. We need to check the boxes, but generally our plan providers and, we get all kinds of guidance with this. This is something new. It's huge. It's very hard to wrap your arms around. So anything that we can do to help, we want to do. We want to put it out there because our objective is to have a secure, retirement plans. So yes, I'm happy to share that.
That's terrific. One of the things that we talk about and we're listening to all the time in the media is AI and how much AI is really going to change just the profile of, what companies and team leaders like the leaders that we have on our call today could go back with and making things more efficient. The problem is also that AI, again, contributes to some of these bad actors, and the bad actors, again, just create more vulnerabilities, whether that's within our software at work or with our vendors, as Lisa mentioned. So, again, these are not only great checklists that Lisa has produced, but I think what really was an eye-opener was the participant education, even that example that you gave on the SPD, Lisa, having some of this information in your orientation packets or SPD, and at the very least, ask your auditors to look at some of the checklists and, maybe some of the questions that you should be asking from all your plan providers in order to protect yourself, as well as your participants. And I think the other piece of it was, including, as you mentioned, your chief technology officer or your IT people. And I guess not necessarily making them fiduciary members, but at least attending the meetings themselves to be able to ask the right questions of the vendors that are presenting. I thought that was just really critical information and great takeaways for our members. I'm going to allow any of you to take yourself off mute if you like. And we've got about a minute left here. If there's anything else that you'd like to ask in the chat box, or just take yourself off of mute, the virtual floor is yours. Okay.
I'll be
Well,
honest,
again,
I can see why there are limited questions. We're being charged with creating a compliance policy for an area that is completely outside of, our scope of expertise. Now, maybe there's a handful of people out there who have this expertise. I'm not one of them. I don't know anybody in who's a fiduciary and in HR or anything like that who is. So this is, I think, one of the most difficult tasks. If you want a plan, you can go buy a plan. But this policy has to be customized for your company. I've got, policies I've put together, but they're meaningless without that IT expertise.
well, with that, Lisa, we'd like to thank you once again. This was so, like I said, not only informative, lots of great critical information, inspiring in the way that, again, it gives our team leaders just, again, the ability to be proactive and, be on the forefront of now thinking through all these different areas that you've provided, and said, hey, you've got some exposure here. So thank you so much. Thank you to all of our members. If you're not a member of the NIHRC, we encourage you to seek us out. As I mentioned, we have terrific what we call coffee chats, and our next wonderful cyber webinar that is coming up will include Secure Act 2.0. With that, I wish everybody a great rest of the day. And again, thank you so much for attending and staying with us this afternoon.
Thank you.